We're in Samach Vav Amud Aleph, and we are in the second paragraph in the middle of the Mishnah. And if you recall the last part of the Mishnah, we're going back and forth between Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Eliezer about doing things on Shabbos. Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbos, and there are a bunch of things that have to be done. We have to slaughter the animal, and the question that we all agree is not a problem. The question is, are you allowed to bring the animal from beyond the tchum? Right? So that was one of the questions that Rabbi Eliezer was arguing that you're allowed to do so. You're allowed to go ahead and let's say you did not have your animal from beyond the tchum, and so you're allowed to bring that. Welcome back. And so you're allowed to bring the animal from beyond the tchum. That is the view of Rabbi Eliezer, and Rabbi Kiva says no. So Rabbi Kiva, the last statement we saw, Rabbi Kiva was kind of setting up Rabbi Eliezer for the final question. Amrullah Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says to Akiva, akarta mashkasavta b'Torah, shkas b'Torah. Akiva came along and brought a kal v'chomer, used logic to argue that you would not be allowed to slaughter the Korban Pesach on Erev Pesach, which falls out on Shabbos. Okay, so he used the kal v'chomer. We're not going to review the kal v'chomer right now, but he used the kal v'chomer to argue. Kal v'chomer is logic. He said logic should dictate you should not be allowed to slaughter the Korban Pesach on Erev Shabbos when Erev Pesach when it falls out on Shabbos. Okay, so he used logic to say no slaughtering the Korban Pesach. So Rabbi Eliezer says, what are you talking about? You're uprooting something which is written in the Torah. B'moado, the Torah says about the Korban Pesach, it's brought in its appointed time, which implies bein b'chol, bein b'Shabbos. The Torah says about the slaughtering of the Korban Pesach that it should be done in its time, and in its time means on Erev Pesach, and that's going to be true whether Erev Pesach falls out on a Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday, or it falls out on a Shabbos, right? That's what the word b'moado means, in its time. So Amar Lo Rabbi Kiva says, and here is the setup. Rebbe, havili moe le'elu kimo l'shchita. Good, you're right. The reason we slaughter the Korban Pesach on Erev Shabbos is because it says slaughter it b'moado, in its time. But find me a moado, it's a point of time regarding carrying something from beyond the tchum. Doesn't say anything about that, right? So therefore, he says, you're right. The reason we slaughter on Shabbos, which is Erev Pesach, is because the Torah says, slaughter it in its time. And that's exactly what you're saying, Rabbi Eliezer. That's why we slaughter it. But now, where's your b'moado? Where's your pasuk that says, in its time, about these other things that you want to do that are not listed in the Torah? And therefore, says Rabbi Kiva, you've just proven yourself wrong. If you're telling me the source why you're allowed to override Shabbos is because the Torah says b'moado about slaughtering, then you have to find me a verse that says b'moado about bringing things from beyond the tchum, and other preliminary things, which Rabbi Eliezer was saying, would also override Shabbos. The fact that it does not say b'moado about those things tells me that there's no allowance to do them. Right? That's basically Rabbi Kiva's argument. And now Rabbi Kiva goes ahead and cites a rule. Klal Rabbi Kiva, Kol malacha she'ef shel asos me'ev Shabbos, anything that could be performed before Shabbos, like bringing it from beyond the tchum, or the other thing was like if it has a wart, you're allowed to take off that wart. That could only be done before Shabbos because it could only be done before Shabbos. Therefore, Eino Dochas Shabbos does not override Shabbos. Shchita, slaughtering, she'ef shel asos me'ev Shabbos, it can't be done before Shabbos because the Torah says b'moado, and we'll elaborate a little bit more in the Gemara. Dochas Shabbos, that does override Shabbos. So again, Rabbi Kiva's argument is things that could be done on Shabbos are able to be done. Things that could only be done on Shabbos will be allowed to be done on Shabbos. Things which could have been done before are going to be done before. The same, by the way, is true when it comes to any malacha on, when it comes to any malacha, similar principle, not identical, but similar principle when it comes to Yom Tiv. Things that you're allowed to do on Yom Tiv are only things that couldn't have been done before or are only going to be beneficial if they're done on the day itself. Anything that could have been done before and it doesn't change it, you can't do on Yom Tiv. So, for example, the reason that you are not allowed to start a fire, right? It's very strange. You're allowed to cook, you're allowed to bake, you're allowed to put things into the oven. Why can't you start a fire on Yom Tiv, right? A regular Yom Tiv. Why can't you put light a match? Why start a new match? Why can't you go ahead and start a new fire? You're allowed to bake, you're allowed to cook. The answer is that you could have done that the day before. In other words, a fire that existed yesterday is no different than a fire that existed today, right? To bake a cake that comes yesterday is different than a cake that comes today. Okay, now you can't, right? That's different. But anything that could have been done before, right? Then you have to do it before. Again, it's not based on the same pasuk, but the same basic principle that anything that could have been done before has to be done before. Okay, bottom line is for the Korban Pesach, Rabbi Kiva points out the slaughtering, which has to be done on Erev Pesach, could only be done on that day, and therefore even if it falls out on Shabbos, you do it on the day. But the bringing of the Karban, the taking off the warts, anything that could have been done the day before has to have been done the day before. Okay, now we have a fascinating Gemara. Tan Rabbanan, we have a brisa. Halacha zonis alma b'nei Basera. This law regarding slaughtering the Karban Pesach on Shabbos, okay, meaning when Erev Pesach falls on Shabbos, was hidden from the sons of Basera. The sons of Basera were the heads of the Sanhedrin. They were known as Bnei Basera. They're living during the time of the second Beis Hamikdash, and they did not know what to do. It came up, there was a year that Shabbos and Erev Pesach fell in the same time. The heads of Sanhedrin didn't know what to tell people. They were confused. So what do they do? So Pam Achas Chol Arba Asalius b'Shabbos. Okay, so one day, 1 year, the 14th of Nisan, meaning Erev Pesach, fell out on Shabbos. Shachuv lo yadu Pesach dochas Shabbos imlav. They forgot. They did not know whether or not you're allowed to slaughter the Pesach and whether or not to override Shabbos. They simply didn't know. So Amr, they said, Klum yesh adam she'yodei Pesach dochas Shabbos imlav. Is there anyone who knows the halacha? Okay, so very humble. They didn't pretend. They go outside and they say, hey, they put announcements. We forgot. We, the heads of the Sanhedrin, don't know the halacha. Is there anyone in the country? Is there anyone around who tells us what to do? Because we don't know if we should be slaughtering the Korban Pesach on Shabbos, which falls out on when Erev Pesach falls on Shabbos. Should we be slaughtering the Korban Pesach? So Amr lahem. So their people said to them, Adam echad yesh shalom Bavel. There's this one man who came from Bavel, the Hillel Habavli Shemo. His name is Hillel the Babylonian. Okay, he was known as Hillel the Babylonian. And by the way, a lot of if your name is the name of a city in modern times, if your name is whatever, I don't know, some Hamburg or whatever, it's usually because you came from Hamburg, not that you lived there then, right? They would oftentimes, if you show up in a new place, they'd say, oh, you're the, you come from that place. Okay, so basically he was Hillel Bavli because he came from Bavel and he now moved to Israel. And he served, he did Shimush. Shimush, as the Gemara is going to emphasize, is in some ways, the Gemara says elsewhere that it's more important to be mishamish tamid chacham. It's more important to be around them than to actually learn from them, because that's when you learn the most. So Hillel, he spent time with Shmai and Avtalion. Shmai and Avtalion were the leaders of the Sanhedrin before. Okay, v'yodem Pesach dochas Shabbos imlav, and he would know whether or not the Korban Pesach overrides Shabbos. Sholchu v'karlo. So Bnei Beser called him. Amrlo, he said to them, Klum yodem Pesach yodochas Shabbos imlav. They said to him, do you know whether or not the Korban Pesach overrides Shabbos? Amr lahem, he said, V'chi Pesach echad yesh lan mashanash dochas Shabbos. There's only one Korban Pesach that we have this question of whether or not override Shabbos. V'alo hara yoser m'masayim Pesachim yesh lan mashanash dochas Shabbos. There are more than 200 quote-unquote Pesach offerings during the year that override Shabbos. What he was referring to was the fact that every Shabbos there are karbanos that override Shabbos, the Karban Tamid and the Musafim, and they override Shabbos. If you go to the Beis Hamikdash on a regular Shabbos, they would bring a Karban Tamid and they would bring the Musaf offering. So you do the math. There's there's 52 Shabbosos, and there's the 2 Tamids, 2 Musaf offerings. So there's over 200 karbanos that are brought every single Shabbos. He refers to them as Pesach offerings because it's similar to the Pesach offering. The Tamid was brought and the Musafim were brought from goats and sheep. So it's just he's just saying, he's like, look, we have all these other things which override Shabbos. Amr lo. So the sons of Sarah said to him, Inayin lecha, where do you know this from? In other words, we need more substantial proof. Amr lahem, he said to them, Nemar mo'adoba Pesach. It says the words in its appointed time regarding the Karban Pesach. Nemar mo'adoba Tamid. It says in its appointed time by the Karban Tamid. Ma mo'ado amr b'tamid dochas Shabbos. Just like everyone agrees that the Karban Tamid, the daily offering, override Shabbos. So af mo'ado amr Pesach dochas Shabbos. So too Karban Pesach, where it says mo'ado, it also overrides Shabbos. Okay, that's number one. You have Gzeir Shava. Mo'ado. Karban Tamid on Shabbos overrides Shabbos. So too, Karban Pesach on Erev Pesach will override Shabbos because of Mo'ado. Ve'od kalachomer says furthermore, I have a kalachomer umat Tamid, the Karban Tamid shein anish kares. If you don't bring it, you don't get the punishment of kares. Dochas a Shabbos, and yet even though it's not so stringent, it still overrides Shabbos. Pesach, when it comes to Karban Pesach, shanish kares, where if you don't do it, you get kares. Eina din dochas Shabbos, for sure it should override Shabbos. Okay, so he said those two things, the Gzeir Shav and the Kalachomer, and what do? To their absolute credit, Miyad Hoshivu Brosh Uminu Nosa Aleim. They made him the head of the group, and they appointed him as the Nasi. They gave him the role of the head of the Sanhedrin. Wow, look at this person, so knowledgeable. They basically vacated their seats, and they gave it to Hillel. Maybe. It seems like this is all happening Erev Pesach. It happened on the 13th and not the 14th. So that would have... Okay. And he would teach them the laws of Pesach. He basically spent the whole day teaching them the laws of Pesach. Okay. Then, fascinating, because this is very seemingly uncharacteristic for Hillel. He started to harass them with words, right? This is like a very shocking Gemara. We know Hillel, who always seems to be the pleasant, the nice, and what did he say? Let's read. Amr lahem, he said to them, Mi garm lechem, who caused this to happen? Why did you forget this halacha? He says, I'll explain to you. She'elem mi Bavel ve'eya nasi aleichem. Who caused this embarrassing thing? I came from Bavel. I'm an outsider. Eretz Yisrael was seen as the more significant place. I'm the Babylonian. I showed up and I became the Nasi over you. What's going on over here? He says, it was your laziness. You did not not spend time with the great ones of the generation, Shmaya V'Talian, and that's why as great as you are, that's why you did not know this halacha. Okay, so the Mefarshim explain that yes, although this is our fan favorite Hillel, who everyone loves because he's so pleasant, bottom line is, there is a halacha, you're supposed to give musar when, you're supposed to give rebuke when rebuke can be listened. He understood that the Bnei Beseira were good people. They were humble people. Imagine to be able to say, they're the Nesiim, they're the heads, they're like the presidents of the country, basically. And they step down because they see someone. These are very lofty people. Those are people who are able to accept musar, and therefore he says, okay, so I'm going to give you musar. In other words, it's appropriate to give musar. It's appropriate to give rebuke when a person could hear rebuke. It's not a good thing to step back from that musar. So it's just speaks, I think, to the characteristic of Hillel. Meaning, Hillel wasn't someone who was just nice. He was someone who was calculated. If it's a person who comes to him and doesn't know anything and doesn't know better, then he'll be kind to them. But if it's someone who is a person who is able to receive rebuke, he gave rebuke, right? So to me, if anything, that speaks to the values of Hillel. He was calculated. It wasn't he was just like a nice person, couldn't be mean, no, or couldn't be strong, I should say, not mean. But no, when he needed to be strong, he was strong. When he needed to be soft, he was soft. Now, as we'll see, the Gemara is going to imply to us and is going to elaborate a little bit more. Maybe he didn't do it in the best way possible. He was, and therefore the next line tells us as follows.
Yeah. It's one thing to be like humble, Beinanim L'Chavero, but this is like for the sake of Torah mitzvah. So it's not like the stories of Hill are usually like he's not gonna
embarrass someone or right.
This is more like the entire Jewish people. You'd be doing the wrong halacha for the entire Jewish people.
Right. Okay, that's fair. There's more that's more that's writing on this, and it's Beinanim L'Chama. Ultimately, their failing is something which, as Nesiim, is a failing for the Klal Yisrael. Good,
but
excellent.
The Bnei Beseira being receptive to Musar is also instructive for us.
Yes, that's right. They listen.
That often doesn't happen.
Yes. Yeah, and Hillel intuited, based on the fact that they're able to vacate the seat, these are the real deal. They're not in for the kavod, they're not in for the honor. They're the ones who went outside and said, we don't know the halacha. And then when they found this person, they stepped back. I mean, these are special people, right? Imagine this happening somewhere. Okay, Amrlo. They said to Hillel, Rabbi, shachach v'lo hevi sakin me'er shamas mahos. They said, okay, great. So we now know we slaughter the Korban Pesach. But what happens if someone forgot their slaughtering knife outside the Beis HaMikdash area? Are they able to carry it on Shabbos? Right? In other words, again, we're talking about Shabbos, Erev Pesach. Or what if you forgot the knife? There's no Erev. Are you allowed to carry that knife into the Beis HaMikdash area? So Amr Lahan, what did he say? Halacha zu shamati v'shachachti. Right? In other words, he's punished over here. He says, I knew this, but I forgot it. Okay, fascinating, right? He gets like immediate punishment. Okay, so the Gemara is going to elaborate more tomorrow. El hanach lehen l'Yisrael. He says, you know what? Leave the Jewish people alone. Im ein neviim hein, b'nei neviim hein. He says, look, I don't know the answer, but we know that the Jewish people, if they are not prophets, they are the sons of prophets. We're going to, if we have time, I want to share with you Bnei Saskar on this whole piece. Basically, what he's saying is like, look, I don't know what to do, but we'll see. The Jewish people know what they're doing. Even if they're not prophets, they have like a spirit of prophecy through them, and they're going to do the right thing. Lamakar, what happened the next day? Meaning, this whole story took place, as I mentioned to Max a second ago, on the 13th. So on the 14th, Erev Pesach, what happens? So people who forgot the knives, what they did is Misha Pischo Tela Tochav V'Tzamro. People who had a sheep, they stuck the knife into its wool. Okay, so in other words, they didn't carry it directly. They put it in their own courtyard. They put it into the wool, and then the animal brought the knife. Okay, Misha Pischo Gedi Tachavo Ben Karnov, a person whose Pesach offering was a goat. They stuck it between the horns. Okay, Ra Maisa. Rahil looks outside, sees what they're doing. V'niskar Lachav Amar. He remembers Allah, and he said, Kach mikublani mipi Shmaya V'Talion. This is what I learned from Shmaya V'Talion. This is the correct thing. Okay, we're going to come back to this Gemara in a moment. Let's just finish to the end of the Amud. Amar Mar Nemar bin Moado Pesach. So the Gemara first now analyze the price we just quoted. So Amar Mar Nemar Moado Pesach, but Nemar Moado Tamid. It says Moado by both Pesach and Korban Tamid. Ma Moado Amar B'Tamid Dochas Shabbos. Right, just like the Moado, which by the Korban Tamid override Shabbos. Af Moado Amar Pesach Dochas Shabbos. So too the Moado that said regarding Pesach, it's going to override Shabbos. Okay, V'Tamid Guf is that's the quote from the Bryson. Now the Gemara analyzed it. V'Tamid. So again, Gzer Shava Moado by Tamid, which says override Shabbos. So Moado by Korban Pesach override Shabbos. The Gemara asked V'Tamid Gufe Minal Dachi Shabbos. Wait a second, you're saying we're going to learn it from Korban Tamid, but who says Korban Tamid override Shabbos? We don't know. Where do we know that? So Ila Mishum Nechsebe Moado. If you want to say because it says in the words in its appointed time, Pesach Nami Nechsebe Moado. The Korban Pesach also says the words Moado. It can't be from the words Moado because then that's circular, right? Because it says it by both Korban Tamid and both by Korban Pesach. So it's not the word Moado that's teaching us anything. It could be Moado means in its time, but not on Shabbos. So Ela Moado Lo Mashmalei, the words in its appointed time is not enough of a statement to imply that it overrides Shabbos. So Achinami Moado Lo Mashmalei. So too, by the Karban Tamid, the words Moado don't tell me that it overrides Shabbos. Ela Markrad, it's from the following pasuk. Olas Shabbos b'Shabbato. Okay, you bring the special Shabbos offering al olas tamid, which is brought with the Karban Tamid. So the Torah says explicitly that Karban Tamid is brought on Shabbos. Now I know the Karban Tamid is brought on Shabbos, and now Moado teaches me, right? So first, Miklal to olas tamid, crave of Shabbos. Right, this teaches me explicitly the olah of the Karban Tamid is brought on Shabbos, and now you have the Gzera Shava, which learns from Karban Tamid, where we see explicitly that it's brought on Shabbos, and you could apply it to Karban Pesach. Amar Mar. Let's go to the second line of the Brisa of Od Kavachomer. Hillel then brought a Kavachomer. He says, "Umat Samashen Anush Kares Dochas Shabbos Pesach Shanosh Kares in Dochas in Odin Dochas Shabbos." So if the Karban Tamid, where it's not as severe, the punishment for not bringing it is not Kares, it still overrides Shabbos. So for sure, Karban Pesach. So the Gemara asks, wait a second, Ikla Mifrach. This is not a good Kavachomer. Kavachomer means it has to be fully logical. So he says it's not a good Kavachomer. Malatamish Kintadar Ukalil. He says you can't say the Karban Tamid is less stringent. It is in one respect, but in another respect, it's daily and it's fully consumed, and therefore from that angle, it's actually more severe. It's more strict than the Karban Pesach, which is not daily; it's only once a year, and it is and it's not totally consumed. So the Gemara says you're right. Kavachomer melahu b'reisha ufarchua v'hadar melahu gzera shava. So you're right. He says Hillel first told them the Kavachomer. They actually asked this question on the Kavachomer, and then he told them the gzera shava. Asked the Gemara v'chimi acher de gamar gzera shava Kavachomer lamali. But if Hillel already knew this gzera shava, which is a pasuk saying moado, why did he even bother with the logic piece? In other words, if I know that there is a Masorah that teaches me that the Karban Pesach overrides Shabbos from the word moado, why do I even bother using logic? I already have the Gzera Shava. So he says, El Lidhu Karmelahu. Really, the Mishnah, the Brisa has to be kind of rearranged, and this is what Hill was telling the Bnei B'Sera. Bishlem Gzera Shava lo Gamritu. He says, I understand that you did not make the Gzera Shava because Dein Adam done Gzera Shava me'atzma. Very important rule. You can't go ahead and make your own Gzera Shava. Gzera Shava, again, is when you have two words that are identical. So you can't go ahead and say, oh, I see the word Vayomer over here, and therefore it means XYZ. We don't have the right to do that. A Gzera Shava is always going to be based on a Masorah going all the way back, okay? So he says, listen, I understand you, Bnei B'Sera, don't have a Gzera Shava because you never learned it. Fine, I get that, I respect that. But he says, El Kav Chomer, 65a4, but a Kav Chomer, Dadam Dami Atzim, which is logical, and therefore you're able to on your own. You should have made on your own. And therefore he tells them, why didn't you make the Kav Chomer? Amrulei, Kav Chomer Prichahu, they said to him, it was a faulty Kav Chomer. And he says, okay, you're right. And therefore, let's just learn it from the Gzera Shava, and that's why you have both the Kav Chomer and in other words, the Gemara is explained like this. Hillel didn't need the Kal Chomer because he had the Gzera Shava. But he's turning to Bnei B'Sera and saying, you guys should have learned the Kal Chomer. Because granted you didn't have the Gzera Shava, but Kal Chomer is logical. Why did you not make this logical inference? And they say it's a bad Kal Chomer. Says, you're right. Okay, but I have the Gzera Shava, and therefore it's all good. Let me just share with you very quickly the Bnei Yissaschar on the whole story about Hillel. So they asked, many asked the question. I understand. Statistically, Shabbos Erev Pesach is going to happen from time to time. Now, keep in mind, their calendar wasn't like our calendar. They had people that had to come in and testify. But, how could it be that Bnei B'Sera didn't know what to do? First of all, some points out, if you do the math, the first Karban Pesach, or maybe the second Karban Pesach fell out on Shabbos, there's no way that this didn't happen historically. Okay, maybe for a few years it didn't happen, but how could they not know that this halacha? So the Bnei Yissaschar suggests that they knew that it happened prior, during the times of the first Beis HaMikdash and before that. But this was during the time of the second Beis HaMikdash. And he says, a little esoteric, a little broader idea, but he says, Pesach represents Hashem's full-fledged abilities. The Temakos, etc. demonstrates Hashem is completely miraculous, overrides everything. The question is, does it override nature? Does Hashem's Kol Yachol, does Hashem's abilities, does that override nature? And he said, of course, previously we saw incredible miracles. During the Bayis Rishon, there were incredible miracles every day. We know back in the day that Pesach, the notion, the idea of Pesach, that Hashem does everything, that overrides Shabbos, which represents creation, represents nature. We know that used to be the case. But during the second Beis HaMikdash, it was a time of nature. Hashem kind of hid himself. There was no daily miracles. It was a time when we didn't have that. And therefore, they were wondering, does that idea still exist even after the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash? Right? That's what they were grappling with. Of course, they knew historically it was done, but that was during a different era when you had open miracles. Now, during this time, we don't have open miracles. Does it still override? And so that Hillel said to them, yeah, that's because you're looking at it from the wrong angle. You're only looking at the miraculous. You're only looking at, the cessation of prophecy, etc., etc. But there still is access to Hashem. Hashem still has access to us through what? Through Talmidei Chachamim, through the Torah. And that's why he says, you didn't serve Shmai V'Talyan. You didn't connect to the Torah. Okay, and therefore, had you done so, you would have recognize that yes, Hashem still does connect us, even in this supernatural way, but not in the same, not as evidently. Okay, and yet he still was missing something, and that's the last part of the Gemara. The last part of the Gemara was that he still, he thought it's only through Torah, and ultimately, what's the final part of the Gemara is that he still didn't know something, and what do you have to rely upon? If you're not Nevi'im, you're B'nai Nevi'im. There still is a sense of prophetic, experience, even if it's not full-fledged prophecy, but we still also connect to Hashem through that medium as well. Don't think it's only through Torah. We also have the experiential element that we're able to connect to Hashem through our inspiration, through our experiences, which is this idea of Nevi'im, B'nai Nevi'im, and that's the B'nai Yisrael we read on this Gemara. Okay, have a great day.